This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. In October of 1959, a new television show debuted on CBS that would leave an indelible mark on the American entertainment landscape for generations. The Twilight Zone was an instant hit, and more than 150 episodes aired in the show's original 5-year run. The show's creator, Rod Serling, became a fixture in American pop culture, and his work would go on to influence hundreds of filmmakers in the horror and thriller genres. The show also served as a breeding ground for future stars. If you watch the old episodes, you're likely to see the younger version of some of your favorite actors. Well, maybe some of your parents' favorite actors. The show was known for its complex and terrifying plotlines, revolutionary camera work, subtle acting performances, and bold, dynamic direction from a stable of young auteurs that would go on to great things in the industry. There were also massive twists built into the storytelling, things you'd never see coming. Many of these jarring revelations would come at the expense of the audience's built-in preconceptions, social blind spots, or just lack of attention to detail. One early famous episode dealt with a bookworm who had a job as a bank teller. This man loved books more than life itself. All he ever wanted to do was sit quietly and read every single book in the world, and given the opportunity, that's exactly what he would do. But pressures of living in society prevented him from living his dream. And he very much looked the part. Waifish and short, studious in his appearance with a crisp shirt and tie, and thick Coke bottle bottom glasses that he needed to be able to see anything, let alone read. He would often lament that there simply wasn't enough time. Not to chase his dreams or start a family, but to read books. Well, as fate would have it in the Twilight Zone, one day, as he took his lunch in the bank vault as usual, because his reading wouldn't be disturbed, outside of the bank, a nuclear holocaust occurs, wiping out the rest of humanity. Our protagonist ventures out to see what the hell happened, and suddenly realizes he's entirely alone. The walls of the bank vault protected him from the nuclear blast. He finds enough canned food to last him the rest of his life, and, most importantly to him, the books in the vast public library survived the disaster. More books than he could ever read. And there's finally enough time. He's the happiest man in the world, as well as the only man in the world. He begins to sort through his books, deciding what to read first. But in his excitement, he accidentally stumbles, and his glasses fall off his face and shatter into a million pieces. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Haunted Hollywood, Part 1. This episode of The Twilight Zone, entitled Time Enough at Last, was the 8th episode of the first season of the show and went on to become a cult classic. The most famous early episode, as well as the episode that people most closely associate with the series overall. The media franchise created by Rod Serling is largely credited with introducing the American public to the genre of science fiction, and the original series is consistently ranked in the top 10 of the greatest TV shows of all time. After being off the air for almost 20 years, the popularity of the show was climbing due to syndication reruns and a new generation of TV consumers becoming aware of the brilliance of the concept, so much so that a feature film was proposed. In 1983, Warner Brothers released Twilight Zone: The Movie, produced by Steven Spielberg and John Landis. It was an interesting concept. 4 30-minute segments, entirely different stories, from 4 different directors. There was also a creepy prologue and epilogue that tied everything together, along with a piece of narration at the top of every episode, something the original TV series was known for. Beyond the title, there were other direct connections to the original series, primarily the fact that each of the 4 segments were, to varying degrees, remakes of episodes from the first 5 seasons. The first segment was called Time Out, a vague remake of the episode A Quality of Mercy, which followed an angry, virulent racist and anti-Semite as he rages against everyone who he claims is keeping him down. This man suddenly finds himself time traveling, and he's in the early 1940s Europe as a Jewish man on the run from the Nazis. Then he turns a corner, and he's a black man at a KKK rally in the deep south of the 1950s. Then he's a Vietnamese man during the war that had him being bombed and shot at by American troops. This first segment was directed by John Landis and starred the actor Vic Morrow. The next segment, directed by Spielberg himself, was called Kick the Can, a remake of an episode of the same name. It involved a mysterious old man who arrives at a nursing home and magically transforms the residents into children again. He leaves the choice of whether or not to return to old age up to them. Segment 3, a remake of the episode It's a Good Life, involved a young boy with incredible supernatural powers. Basically, anything he imagines becomes reality. A kind and loving teacher in her early 30s happens to meet the boy and experiences the magic and horror that his powers conjure up. She offers to be his teacher and help him use his powers to do amazing things. The 4th segment and epilogue is a very faithful retelling of the Nightmare at 20,000 Feet episode. In that story, it's a young William Shatner who plays a man with a fear of flying who happens to be the only person awake on a cross-country overnight flight. He peers out the window and sees a creature on the wing attempting to damage the aircraft. Every time he tries to alert someone to what's happening, the creature hides out of sight, leading the passengers and the man himself to believe that he's having a psychotic episode. The remake, starring a young John Lithgow, has the updated title of Nightmare at 40,000 Feet, but it follows the exact same plotline. So I was around 10 years old when this movie came out, but I probably didn't see it until a year later when it either landed on HBO or on VHS that I could rent at the local video store. It was rated PG, but I was still too young to see it in theaters because I had night terrors as a kid and my mom did her best to keep me away from horror films. My brother and I loved the movie though, especially Nightmare at 40,000 Feet. We probably watched it 20 times. There's a man on the wing of this plane! But it would be more than 15 years before I learned that a real-life horror show had unfolded during the filming of one of the segments. And it was scarier than anything a Hollywood writer could dream up. So much so that people began talking about the entire production being cursed. So after the prologue, which is really just 2 guys driving in a car late at night on a desolate back road, they're listening to music and talking about their favorite TV shows. When the topic of the Twilight Zone comes up, they discuss their favorite scary stories. Then the passenger asks the driver if he wants to see something really scary. Then he turns into a monster and eats the driver. I admit, it scared me shitless, and that was just the first 5 minutes of the movie. But what we're going to be discussing today is the first full segment of the movie, the segment called Time Out. As mentioned earlier, it's about an angry racist who gets transported back in time to various places where the people who are the object of his hatred were treated especially poorly. and he's viewed now as one of them. First, he's a Jew in 1940s Europe, etc. But we need to talk about the physical production of the segment, the actors, the director, the stunt team, and the special effects team. The lead actor was a man named Vic Morrow. Morrow was 53 years old at the time of his casting. A native of the Bronx in New York City, he started his career on the stage before graduating to small roles in films and large roles on television. He enjoyed a long, steady career, if never quite becoming a bona fide movie star. Morrow had 2 daughters, one of which, Jennifer Jason Leigh, did become a movie star in her own right, starring in gritty crime dramas throughout the 90s and beyond, after achieving basically overnight stardom for her turn as Stacy in the cult classic Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Morrow, a seasoned actor, was cast for his tough guy persona, his ability to play vulnerable anger, and, to a lesser degree, the fact that he wasn't a household name. Therefore, audiences were more likely to believe his character. The director of the segment, John Landis, is something of Hollywood royalty. He had a string of hit films throughout the 1980s, including Animal House, The Blues Brothers, An American Werewolf in London, Trading Places, The Three Amigos. He even directed Michael Jackson's legendary music video, Thriller. So production gets underway at various locations in Los Angeles. The interiors were shot in a soundstage on a studio backlot, while the exteriors, and there were many exteriors, were spread across often used properties on the outskirts of the city. If you watch the segment, everything happens in one night. Nothing is during the day, which means the production consisted of several, probably 15 to 20 overnight shoots to get everything they needed for the show. That's tough on the actors, the crew, it's tough on everyone. So much so that the state of California has strict limits on the hours that children can work at night. Back then, minors with a valid work permit couldn't be on sets past 9 p.m., and this will become important later in the story. 90% of the shoot goes off without a hitch. They were just a few days from finishing when they came to a massive scene during the Vietnam sequence. Morrow, who looks the same to us throughout the show, but is viewed differently by other people within the story depending on where he is at the time, finds himself in war-torn South Vietnam being pursued by the U.S. Army. Along the way, his character comes across 2 orphaned Vietnamese kids, and despite his previous hatred of all Vietnamese people, he decides to try and save them. This was an attempt to give the character some type of redemptive quality, although in the original script, that act of kindness would ultimately lead the 2 kids straight into a Nazi gas chamber. One of those creepy Twilight Zone twists. Just when you think something nice is going to happen, bam, nope. Anyway, the chase scene in Vietnam involved an Army helicopter chasing Morrow and the 2 kids, a machine gunner hanging out the side trying to shoot him. All the while, massive mortar rounds are exploding everywhere in this large rice paddy. So we have an actor and 2 child actors trying to run through about 30 yards of knee-deep water at night, with pyrotechnic explosions going on all over the place and a real helicopter hovering about 25 feet above them with a massive machine gun shooting really loud blanks like freaking crazy. Pure chaos, in other words. But it's what the director wanted, so it's what they gave him. As far as set safety goes, there were 2 main concerns: the helicopter and the pyrotechnics. More specifically, the helicopter in relation to where the pyrotechnic explosions would be going off. It was a highly choreographed sequence that involved the pilot and the FX team working closely together. The altitude of the helicopter was so low, and the explosions of the fake mortar rounds were so big that if they weren't careful, the helicopter could be damaged. But they figured it out. The pilot knew the sequence and location of the blasts, and he would maneuver the chopper out of the way of each explosion, resulting in a dazzling, truly terrifying visual feast of action filmmaking. But Vic Morrow hated helicopters. A few years earlier, on a job that required him to actually ride in one, he demanded a $1 million life insurance policy in case he died during the shoot. He ended up fine, although scared half to death, but he still didn't like helicopters. So the night of the shoot for the Vietnam sequence for The Twilight Zone, which took place at a filming location called Indian Dunes in Valencia, about 30 minutes north of Los Angeles, Vic Morrow told the stunt coordinator that, man, he wished he'd hired a stunt double that night because he had a bad feeling about the sequence. Further, he remarked that he'd always worried that he would die in a helicopter accident. And okay, the 2 child actors playing the Vietnamese children were hired illegally. They were being paid under the table due to their lack of work permits. And speaking of the lack of work permits, Landis knew they would never have been granted anyway. Hollywood child labor laws restrict, as mentioned earlier, kids being on set past 9 p.m., and the shoot didn't even begin until after 10 p.m. Plus, those same laws restricted kids being in close proximity to explosions. That's the only thing these kids were going to be in close proximity to during this shoot. There were explosions everywhere. Plus, either a social worker or licensed tutor needs to be on set at all times. All of those restrictions were ignored. And further, both the children and their parents were instructed not to mention anything to either the safety officer or the fire inspector, both of whom could have shut down the set. At around midnight on July 23, 1982, the cameras rolled, and the controlled chaos of a Hollywood action sequence began unfolding. The helicopter was hovering as the fake machine gun began pumping out rounds. The first mortar explosions bathed the fake village in an orange glow as water sprayed everywhere out of the exploding rice paddy. And there we find our hero, the actor and the 2 kids, desperate to escape but reluctant to leave the cover of their tiny hut. But then they're spotted from above, and it's time to make a run for it. Heroically, Vic Morrow takes a kid under each arm. They were only aged 6 and 7 years old, and he begins to run across the rice paddy. His performance is breathtaking. The pain and anguish and desperation on his face is palpable. They were halfway across the rice paddy when everything went bad. According to court transcripts, one of the mortar explosions went off a few seconds too early. It's believed that the metal cover of the pyrotechnic shot directly upwards and struck the tail rotor of the helicopter, sending it into an uncontrolled spin. It had been hovering so low that no one had time to react or even comprehend what was happening. The helicopter crashed into the middle of the fake rice paddy, landing directly on the 3 actors. The main rotors of the helicopter decapitated both Morrow and one of the children, while the other child was crushed by one of the helicopter's skids. They all died instantly. As you might expect, there was a massive investigation that lasted nearly a decade and resulted in a 9-month trial that saw the director, John Landis, tried for 3 counts of involuntary manslaughter. It was the first time in Hollywood history that a director was held responsible for the dangerous actions on his set. And the trial divided the industry. It cost people friendships and ultimately resulted in a slew of new on-set safety regulations and harsh penalties for circumventing child labor laws. But no convictions. Landis was ultimately acquitted of all charges and would go on to build his legendary career. But he's been haunted by that night ever since. The Twilight Zone, the movie, would be released on June 24th, 1983, less than a year after the tragedy. And it was a hit, earning more than $42 million at the box office on a budget of only $10 million. In the end, despite all the new regulations and safety protocols, perhaps Spielberg, who ended his friendship with Landis as a result of the incident, perhaps he summed it up best of all when he said simply, "No movie is worth dying for." Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.